Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for tuning into this Enabling Change and Innovation webinar. Today's webinar is looking at a rather daunting topic. How do you go about developing a new app? With over 1 million apps already available through the iTunes Store and Google Play, it can't be too hard, can it? Yet, the thought of doing this fills many of us with dread, as there's a perception that they're both difficult and expensive to produce. To guide us through the land of apps and learn how we can best navigate it without peril, we're privileged to have Tom McCue joining us today from Canberra. Tom is a Program Manager at GRDC, the Grains Research and Development Corporation. His work includes the development of delivery platforms to accelerate the adoption of research, development and extension by working with growers, advisors, extension providers, grains industry stakeholders and the public. The platforms include digital-based technologies, social media, and the delivery of face-to-face technical training. Tom's been with GRDC for 14 years and has a Bachelor of Science and an MBA. He enjoys testing new and novel technologies with an emphasis on enhancing the quality of engagement, collaboration, and networking. Tom, I reckon we might have been twins separated at birth, as those are the things that I enjoy doing too. Anyway, it's great to have you along today. Over to you now, Tom.
Thanks, John, and thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. Interestingly, it was great to see those statistics at the commencement, just to see that there was a large audience that still is looking at app development as an opportunity, but also something that they know probably very little about. So in today's talk, I'm going to go through a number of factors that you should think about and consider when it comes to making a choice for going forward with an app or electronic device which will suit your audience. Just a quick overview. I think the first important thing to understand is how can apps be a useful tool in your information arsenal? How will they actually develop your relationships with your stakeholders to make interaction and engagement be a two-way thing? And as John pointed out at the start, it's really about that. It's how do you engage with your audience to make sure that they're getting targeted information, but also enabling them an opportunity to share and engage with you as an organisation. I'm going to cover the stages of app development and some of the steps that GRDC went through in terms of looking at how we went about developing our first apps and some of the things that we learned throughout that process, but also some of the core elements that you need to think about when considering moving down the app development path. I'll also talk about platform choices. It's a common question we hear often from our stakeholders about developing products across a suite of products, and we'll cover that throughout the webinar today. Looking at how do you go about searching for an app developer? What are the things you need to look at if you've decided to go down the path of developing apps? And then finally, today we'll talk about some of the lessons that we learned and some of the core elements to consider based on the discussions that we've had. So I'll just open by saying, well, why do we use apps? And I like using this picture of a farmer down in Western Australia. His name is McCue. He is quite an innovative grower who likes using technology in his farming enterprise. And basically, at the end of the day, what you're looking for is developing something that your stakeholder audience needs and wants from you as an organisation, and how you deliver that content. And in the case of GRDC, we've had a lot of feedback from our industry asking us to stick with new technologies as they come on board and look at how we can exploit that to really enhance not only research, development and extension outcomes, but also experiences that we can have with our stakeholders. And similarly to how we can use that to encourage collaboration and sharing amongst different segments of the audience. Technology, dear to my heart, and something that many of you who know me well know that I'm constantly analysing and checking for new opportunities. App development and the advent of smartphone and tablet technology has really taken off in recent years. As you've probably seen, there's a lot of new developments happening pretty much on a daily basis, but there's an ever sweeping spectrum of products that are becoming available on the market, and the one you see on the screen here is the new Apple iOS CarPlay, which has been released in the United States. So obviously you may have heard about it in the media, but it's definitely a product that Apple are moving into. You've probably heard murmurs about watches, other visual technologies such as Google Glass, and you know there's an endless scope of opportunity when it comes to technology. So as a developer of information products for your organisation, you know, one of the things that you must be conscious of is technology and how it rapidly emerges and how your stakeholder audience may adopt it. Whether or not you decide to go down the app path, there will always be a segment of an audience that tends to take up the technology. So it's important to consider that when you're thinking about whether apps or other tools are useful in your arsenal. It's also important to realise as an organisation or entity where you sit within, I guess, the wider spectrum. You heard in John's introduction, there's up to 1 million apps available in the various app stores and Google Play stores. And in our instance, agriculture is no different. This slide was just a sample of some of the tools that have been put on the market over recent time. You can see there's a lot of noise. And I guess you as an extension professional or a researcher or a grower or advisor need to think about how do you use the tool. Are there other products already existing on the market that might serve the same purpose? And how do you complement them and or align with them to develop products for your stakeholder audience and make sure that they have access to the best product and quality products. This one's probably a testament to the growth of technology, but also the development of information and knowledge as a whole in industry. And GRDC is no different. We, like many organisations in the grains industry, are looking in our archives, in our filing cabinets, and in our computer networks and systems to look at how we can potentially not only bring information to the market, but repurpose it and make it available to the different audiences. Now, information isn't just constrained to filing cabinets or other devices. As you can see in this photo here, people are using the tools and technologies not only to seek information and capture information, but also to engage in unique events and experiences. And it's something that you need to be conscious of as a professional in terms of how you can not only, I guess, ride the wave of information, but also use some of these technologies to harness not only collaboration amongst individuals, but also how you get the information from experiences back to your organisation to help you target and foster really rich information exchange and engagement. Bearing in mind, the more information, it also creates more noise, and you as an organisation need to be mindful of that. We often hear in the grains industry of information overload, survey overload, and a whole range of issues with people being time poor. So it needs to be considered carefully in the context of making sure that you consider that in the development of your product. With that comes real-time demands, and I think John mentioned at the start about multitasking and how ineffective it can be, but conversely it can also be a very effective tool, and our audience is no different. They're using tools and technologies out there to really value add to their existing farming operations. A lot of the information can now be delivered in real time, as it can be collected in real time. So in terms of considering your information products and services that you might offer via an app, you need to be mindful of that and look at how you can potentially service that information sharing activity. Decision making is moving more towards the support of information products and services. That's not to discount the power and engagement of face-to-face interaction with people that influence you, but also people are using some of these sources as a real tool to supplement their decision-making processes. And farmers are no different. As I heard when some of the apps came out, people are using it to listen, to view, to forecast, and they're also using it to capture. So some of those core functions that historically you may have done on a notebook or pad, or you might not have done in your environment, are really driving that interaction and engagement in a real-time environment. So when you're developing a product, you need to be mindful of this. In terms of infrastructure, and I do apologise about the colours. There was a small issue with one of the graphs here, but we, as GRDC, ask predictions and trends of our stakeholder audience, and one of that includes the use of technology by growers, particularly in this instance electronic technology. And while many people are using email and increasingly using websites, you'll see from this graph that the apps are increasingly becoming an important tool in a grower's arsenal to make not only better information exchange, but also to make decisions and collaboration on farm. And you can see in this instance, over 20–25% of our growers are currently using apps in their development. Some up to just over 40% are using them occasionally and rarely, but you can see from the spike there that in 2 years' time, potentially up to 60% of our grower audience may be using apps in some shape or form. So it's important to understand your segment needs when determining how you might use the app. Look at their characteristics and traits to see what tools they're using, and from an app perspective, asking questions about potential and current use. So probably just to wind up the first session, why do we want to use apps? I just reiterate, technology is really emerging at a rapid pace. A lot of the feedback I get from people suggests that technology is moving too fast, so it's probably something you need to also be mindful of when thinking about the ongoing growth of the apps that you may or currently have to develop. We're also living in a very information-rich society, so if you can develop tools and products that not only leverage from that, but also make life easier for the users and potentially collate large volumes of data, then there's another reason for using apps. There's also the real-time demands, as I mentioned, where there is increasing growth in the development of products, and then obviously the decision-making process is being opened up to a much wider scale of scrutiny, but also application by our stakeholder audience. So with that, John, I'll probably finish off the first session and take a few questions about apps.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for keeping the time too. I appreciate that. We've had a few questions come in. So, folks, this is when you can type in the little comments box down the bottom and send in some questions for Tom. So the first one is, Tom, the graph that you displayed just a few slides back, what was the date when that data was collected, please?
That data was collected in 2013. We do a biannual, biannual information products and services survey of not only growers but also advisors, and one of the questions we ask is how they use electronic technologies both currently and potentially. So that data was from survey we ran last year.
Excellent. So nice and fresh. Thanks for that. Tom, has GRDC as an organisation, has it seen apps as an important tool as part of the work that they do?
Definitely. I think we very much have evolved in app development initially to utilise technology as it emerged, and as you can be aware, we probably entered the market in the very early stages when apps were fairly much a new product within smartphones, particularly for agriculture, and we continue to see their use and growth, and I'll talk about evaluation a little later, but there is increasing demand of GRDC to develop, I guess, products in a format that's portable for our growers, so that and the people that service them, so that they can take information in their pocket or in their briefcase or in their ute and use it out in the field and apply it.
That's good. Tom, I can see lots of people are wanting to ask specific questions about your apps and the development process you use. So how about you move on to your next section, and I'll catch up on those questions at the end of that.
Okay, so yeah, thanks John. I'll keep moving. So basically the second part of my discussion today was to talk about how GRDC and has used, I guess, different stages in its development cycle to develop products that would be available to our audience. And you'll see on the next screen that's on your webinar, these were some of the core issues that we faced when developing our apps. So the first area, and I'll go through these in depth, but obviously the first one that I'm going to cover is developing specific user requirements for your stakeholder audience, developing planning and tendering processes. In the instance of GRDC, we actually went to market to look at the development of apps. Obviously, as important as this section is, contracting, scoping and refinement on the product and service was a core element. You then move into your development, and then obviously testing and go live are also important stages. I've inserted this slide just to let people think about some of the thoughts that go through our mind in terms of what would actually go into an app, and some of these apps have been developed by GRDC, but some of our partners have also developed apps throughout various GRDC projects. But some of the things to think about are the types of content that you'd also be using in the app. Are you looking to make your app into an identification tool, which GRDC very much did so in the first instance. We predominantly took products that we knew existed, that were popular, they had an application, and in this instance we were focusing very much on our grower audience because they wanted tools to be able to identify weeds, pests and diseases in the paddock, and so we very much started on a identification phase. But there are other forms of content that can also be built into apps, whether they be diagnostic tools, calculators. GRDC has some investments in that space as well, but also developing comparative information. And it was good to see the crop disease app, which our partners in DEPI have developed. Looking at some comparative information there to look at management options for diseases particularly in Victoria, but also in different areas by crop type. There's also learning resources. Obviously they're very strong sources of content to be developed into apps. And then obviously the big ones, decision support tools, a very important element in terms of determining some of the content sources that you might be wanting to use. I put this independently because it's such an important phase in thinking about app development. It's the ongoing development phase that you undertake in an app, because often people think, oh well, I'll just go and build an app. What they don't think about is, okay, I've developed the app, job's done. One of the things, GRDC has learnt this as well, is that apps are an ongoing development process. There's increasing demands to add new functionality, new features to exploit different areas of the app. And so it's not a case of develop it and then they'll come and then the job's done. You need to think about your ongoing resourcing requirements in terms of app development. So coming back to user requirements, it's about knowing your audience. As I mentioned in the introduction, looking at the products and services that they may currently be using. And I'm not just talking about apps in this instance, I'm talking about hard copy or other tools that they might be using, publications, fact sheets, other forms of information that they might be accessing via the web. Looking at the types of information they're seeking to get information, and then look at the available products and services that already exist, and look at the strengths and weaknesses that you might have as both an information provider or a collaborator, as I mentioned earlier. How exclusive is the product that you might be wishing to develop as an app? Is it something that doesn't exist on the market? And I use our Weeds app as an example. When we first started, there weren't any available agricultural weed apps in the Australian market whatsoever at the time we developed it. Now, if you look on there, you'll see that both public and private organisations have entered that space. So it's a matter of looking at what's out there, how credible is it, what information gaps might exist, and then how can they work potentially together or independently. So it's important to know that in the context of your users that are actually planning to use that. Who are your target audiences, and what are they accessing, and what are some of the functions that they need? And that probably leads in nicely to the scope of functionality. What will your app do and what won't it do? That's very important when considering the development of it, to make sure that your end user is getting something that they can actually use and apply, and not necessarily developing a tool that might not be any use to them. We deliberately picked our Ute Guide series in the first instance because we knew that growers in the field need to diagnose pests and insects and weeds. So we definitely picked that as a first option in our instance, so that they had something that they could use out in the paddock. This next graph here is a survey that grain growers actually produce, and they do similar research like we do. They ask questions about what types of apps should be developed in their survey. There's a number of areas there, everything from weather forecasting to weed pest ID management, agronomic information and news. And interestingly, at the bottom there, they want one app that does everything. But I raise that because it's such an important issue. You've got to actually think about what you can deliver to them. So it's not a matter of just the needs and wants, but what you actually have in your information and knowledge arsenal to address the issue. So the core message here is talk to your stakeholders, talk to the people that are going to supply information if it's not yourself, and also think, if it is yourself that's supplying it, think about the products that you might be able to offer to them. I get this question all the time, what platform should I choose? Well, it really comes down to your audience, and in that last slide we talked about what are some of the things that our audience actually likes to see in terms of practicality and functionality, but similarly, what tools do they use? You're not going to develop a BlackBerry product if all your users are using iOS or Android. You need to think about that. If your marketplace is spread, get as much information as you can about the types of tools that, and also the platforms that your users are using to make a call on what development platforms you actually need to develop the product on. Obviously, if you can analyze your own audience, that's better. If you can't, obviously you need to look at other sources that might be out there. Use some surveys, use your informal discussions. Even just if you're at an event or another activity where some of your core stakeholders that you're trying to target are at, look at their behaviours, look at what they're using. You know, are they writing notes in a paper book? Are they sitting on their iPad collating information? Do they sit there and record tools? You know, all these tools and functions are free market intelligence in terms of determining the type of product that you can also develop in your app. In terms of usage behaviours, I mean, don't think just how they are in time, as we talked about right at the beginning. Technology is moving quickly, so if you can, try and get an understanding of what their future demands might be, so that you can future-proof the product that you're developing and the platforms that you're using. And using our example with the weeds, at the time we entered the market, we had data to show that a large volume of our growers were using iOS applications. Over time, that's changing. You probably see it in the press all the time about Android growing in market share and the demise of BlackBerry and other platforms. That does occur, but I stress you need to check with your audience first. Talk to them. Talk to the people that you're actually trying to service in your industry. You know, what models do they use? What supporting infrastructure is required? Because every platform that you develop on requires a different form of coding, potentially. And it also offers different suites of functionality depending on the type of product that you decide to develop on, all products. Look at the market shares. As I said, look at the time and spatial components. Are there any trends or patterns of your users in terms of their usage behaviours, and also the tools that they're using to access it? And also your development considerations. I mentioned earlier that different platforms have different functionality. Look at the unique feature sets that those platforms have to offer, and make a call basically on the types of delivery that you'd like to achieve with your audience. And I use HTML5. That's obviously gives you greater flexibility to provide information across platforms without significant costs in development, so that's something you need to be conscious of as well. And we probably don't have time to go into HTML5, but I've spoken with John, and we will be providing some resources and links to people that don't know about HTML5, or alternatively you can contact me. So you've made the call, you know your audience and you know what they want. Okay, who's going to do it for you? Are you going to do it yourself? Well, some people may say yes, but there is obviously a degree of technical knowledge that will be required depending on the complexity of the functionality. Importantly, get your user requirements right. Make sure that you understand your audience before you even think about how you're going to develop it, because often people go, oh, well, I'll just give it to Joe Bloggs down the road and he'll solve all the world's problems. Often Joe Bloggs down the road doesn't know your audience like you do, so you need to get those user requirements right. Once you get that right, when you're going out to find somebody, make sure that if you go through a process that you have the confidence that the person or persons or organisations that are doing it for you have an understanding of what those requirements are, that you take the time to explain those requirements clearly, and that you answer any questions that they might have about your audience. Now, like any developer, they will take on a degree of risk and resourcing to try and service the need. So you just need to be aware that it's not a one-way street. You don't just rely on somebody to develop it for you. They will require significant input from you or the people that you designate to provide ongoing intelligence to them. Now, consider your ongoing costs as well. It's also important to understand that. And I spoke earlier about ongoing support. That's definitely something that you need to factor in when you're looking at your costs, particularly as you go live and go to market. So there's some basic rules of operation when it comes to refining your requirements. As I mentioned earlier, make sure that your context is understood with the person that's going to help you develop it if you're relying on an external party. Try and document things. One thing I found through GRDC is if you can really document the understanding of your requirements, it provides a mechanism upon which you and the developer can agree or disagree on and come to a common agreement as things are being developed. Make sure you've got resources available. You will get questions from the people that want to develop it. They'll ring you up when you least expect it, asking questions. Well, you know, what does this thing mean and what does that thing mean? The only person that can answer that generally is yourself, because you know your audience probably the best, and you'll be able to answer those questions. If you've got the time and resources, obviously use people that are likely to be users of the platform. Try and use real people within your own sector and any experts. Get honest and brutal feedback. It's better to do it before you hit the market in a live environment. And if you are going to go across multiple platforms, test all of them. Don't test one. You need to make sure that the same functions that you've described work for the user audiences no matter what platform they use. And just be very careful. There's a really nasty thing called scope creep, and while people think it's often the developer that creates this, it's the other way around generally. As you develop and as the concept comes up, you'll often say, oh gee, I wish it did that as well. Now, there will be a limit to which a developer will actually accommodate some of those needs without you having to reach for your pocket for more money. So you just need to be careful when you're thinking about your user requirements and your development. Now, I'm conscious that if you don't do that, you'll never get a product, so you have to draw a line in the sand. And this picture here was our first app, which was made available firstly on iOS, and the nice lady on the left there is Nikki Watson, who is our webmaster, and she did a brilliant job in terms of providing a lot of the testing that I mentioned earlier when it came to looking at those requirements and making sure that what we said on paper was delivered in an electronic product. But there were times when both of us were sitting over our computers and testing and retesting, and often testing many times to get the product working. So think of that from your resourcing perspective. I'm just conscious I went a little over time there, but I think that's important in the context of your development, and I'll open it up for questions, John.
Great, thanks Tom. So people from Australia across to Canada just want to know, how much does it cost to develop an app? Can you give us some ballpark figures, please, Tom?
Yeah, well, I guess it really comes down to the complexity of the app that you're developing. They can range from probably several $1,000s for a very basic app up to potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the degree of functionality that you might want to employ in an app. Bearing in mind, a lot of developers often scale apps as well. When you go to market, they'll often charge quite heavily for the first app because it's a risk for them, obviously, to take it on board. But if you do repeated applications with an organisation, they often scale the costs down. So you may start with a very large bill and end up with a very much smaller bill, which may be in the thousands mark. But once again, the cost of these things is improving over time, particularly as new technologies come on board and more HTML5 and other applications are to make app development more of a click and develop rather than a code and development process. As they come to market, the cost is coming down. But yeah, in answer to that question, they can range from a few thousand to hundreds of thousands.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Several people are asking about I guess it's about the app developers that you chose, and we know you probably don't want to disclose them today, but in general terms, did you go for someone within Australia or from India, the Philippines?
To date, all developers that GRDC has used have been Australian developers. We have been fortunate in the sense that we have very close support from those developers. We've had developers in Canberra in a lot of the apps that we've developed, but we're more increasingly using a range of app developers in some of the new apps that are under development at the moment. So we have used Australian-based development teams. Some of those development teams have been supported by a global infrastructure of programmers, some that have developers right throughout Asia, Europe, and increasingly across Australasia. And but the development teams that have provided support to us have actually been local, been in Canberra or in close vicinity to the GRDC, which is useful when it comes to getting that support and, I guess, to some extent, personalisation of the requirements.
And Tom, do you just put out a tender as such and invite them to come to you, or do you send your requirements to known developers?
It's a bit of a mix. Predominantly we go for an open tender process just to give the market an opportunity to respond. There are lots of app developers out there, but you know, we probably spend more time, John, on the actual user requirements when we put them out to market. You know, we want to be clear that if we're going to develop an app that looks at a certain RD&E issue, that the person that's responding to that is actually addressing that issue when they provide a methodology and approach to responding to that need from the corporation. So, by and large, we have gone to market where we've developed apps to ensure that that we get a good product and that people understand the product. But there have been some apps that have been developed to coincide with our website as well.
Okay. And are there any kind of hidden ongoing fees maybe from Apple? So there's a question about Apple fees for iPad apps that aren't available for the general public through the iTunes Store, and the fees.
There are all the apps that we've provided to date are free. We haven't charged for applications because you know, obviously we're funded by a grower levy, and so we reinvest those resources into products that enable app development free of charge to Australia and New Zealand users. But if you do apply a charge against your application, there are certain guidelines and criteria where the software developers do take a proportion of the earnings from those applications. But I can say from GRDC's perspective, all of our apps have been free, so we haven't been subject to any of those conditions. But if you are planning to charge for your app, just be aware that there are conditions that you need to consider that go beyond the I guess the criteria that you need to address for complying with Apple and Google requirements and Windows, BlackBerry.
Yep. Okay. Tom, you've done really well. I think we need to move on to the next section, so then we can we'll address the next batch of questions then.
Okay. So I guess I've spoken about some of the elements that help you decide whether or not to go down an app and the scope of functionality, and also the steps that you go through to develop an app. The next one is about ongoing support, and I use this picture because, as I mentioned earlier, you develop an app, and basically once that app is developed, many people think that the job's done and there's nothing more to consider. Well, I call it the tsunami that's pending when it comes to an app, because in this picture you can see the massive wave coming towards the people and they're running towards it. From an app perspective, often we'll put a tool on the market and then think that job's done, it'll look after itself. And our experience has shown that it's really the beginning when you actually hit the market with an app, because one of the advantages of a real-time environment where people can engage and collaborate is they can also be very open and frank about their views on the application. And one of the things that we learnt pretty quickly when we put it first on the market with our weeds app was that some of our growers really didn't like it. You can see some of the comments on the screen there about not many weeds. We had some issues with crashing, some zooming, and while some of those things were small, others were larger, they do have a big bearing on the support that your audience may have for, I guess, your product. And one of the things that we were fortunate enough to know about and was the fact that Nikki and myself and others were ready to listen and take on board comments. Our development team that helped develop the app also were on board for support, particularly at Go Live, and we were ready to try and alleviate many of the issues that we had when we first launched. So a couple of things: listen. And I say that, listen again, and probably listen another time. And don't use just your electronic resources to do that. Use every trick in the arsenal that you can have, whether that's just listening to your stakeholders at forums, online, across the phone, talking to experts and others, and get that feedback. Ultimately, this is why your user requirements is so important, because if you do that well, you shouldn't get too many feedback issues. But that being said, if you can test with your audience, you're in a much better shape of actually getting a product that they like. And we did that extensively. But once again, you've got people that will have very strong opinions, and I stress that first impressions count. So you've got to be ready to update. You've got to manage those expectations. You've got to tell people what the application does and what it doesn't do. So if you can build that into your architecture and your communications that support the launch of the app, you need to make that clear. With our Weeds app, we had feedback from an audience saying that they wanted the ability for the phone to be held up in front of a weed and that the camera automatically detect the weed and provide the information. Now, at that time, apps were very primitive, cameras weren't great, so we were very clear in telling people that it's great feedback, but in the first launch of the app that we weren't going to achieve that expectation. So you need to hold your ground sometimes, particularly when you first enter the market, and make it clear about what you can and can't do. As I mentioned earlier, our content providers were critical. We obviously worked closely with some of our weeds researchers to make sure that they were aware that the product was going on. We got their input prior to the launch, so a lot of the information was really helpful. Using that example by Farmer Elvis there, I was able to go to a weed specialist and actually get some more information following contact to actually populate the weeds that weren't necessarily in there in the first instance. And yeah, be ready for demand, because it will come, particularly if you promote it heavily. So if you do a lot of those things that I've mentioned in this slide, you'll get very good ratings straight after you roll out updates and implementation of new improvements. So yeah, we implemented a lot of the feedback we received in the first instance, and we were getting very good response rates on the app. That being said, it's something that continuously evolves, and I talked about ongoing maintenance. In our instance, you've got to keep updating it to make sure that you satisfy that need, and also understand where the goalpost might shift. Constantly check for those user requirements, particularly after you go live as well, because the minute you put a product in somebody's hand, they'll think of another idea on what can happen to that application. So if you apply those principles I mentioned earlier, you'll come a long way in terms of developing and evolving a product as you gain more feedback from your stakeholders. So what are some of the core lessons we learnt? You probably heard in those last couple of slides, it's about listening. You know, you've really got to evaluate and listen right throughout the project, from the point of conception of the tool, where you're thinking, oh gee, I'd like to develop an app on insects, right through to the point where you launch it, right to the point after you're doing the ongoing maintenance. You need to use a suite of tools to evaluate. There are plenty out there, but also use some of your more traditional tools to test your product throughout the development. Resource the communications and promotion. You can easily put an app on the App Store, but as John pointed out right at the beginning, there's a million apps on there, so you're one of a million potentially, and don't rely just necessarily on Apple and Google to do all the hard labour for you. Make sure you communicate and promote your product when you put it out there. And as I said earlier, manage the user expectations, what it will and won't do. And I use probably the latter to suggest what it doesn't do, because expectations will be high when you put it out to market. Importantly, you need to resource the tool. You need to make sure that you've got the people there, not only from your developer side, but also from your side. You need to make sure that you've got experts that can be drawn upon, that you can provide that ongoing intelligence to the people that are developing the tool, bearing in mind that most of the people that are developing it will be IT background. They're not agricultural specialists. So you need to find that common ground about explaining what it should do. I always say to people, draw it. You know, in this instance, you can see the ground cover web-based app on iOS. It's actually a web-based tool, but you know, draw it on the screen. Don't be afraid to visualize what you think the end product might look like, so that the app developer can get in your head about what you see it looking like. But simultaneously, if they've got ideas, get them to draw it. And you'll find that pictures say 1,000 words. It's definitely a very important element in your app development cycle. And importantly, from a resourcing but also a content perspective, how often are you going to update it? You know, if you're going to put it on the market and not update it, well then, will it have a certain lifespan? You know, what's version 2 and version 3 of your app going to look like? Now, if you're going web-based, obviously there's a lot of advantages because it will update. But in our instance, we started off with apps where web accessibility wasn't great, so we had to go down the native path. However, that being said, as it is improving, we're expanding into web-based technology as well. But regardless of what technology you use, you need to think about how often you're going to put new material on it to make it relevant and interesting for your audience. So just to conclude, you know, I hope some of the core messages that you've taken out of this meeting is there is an increasing demand for electronic technologies, including applications, as a suite of tools within your extension and communication arsenal. You need to think carefully about your requirements and the app development cycles that support it, with a specific emphasis on the post-go live to look at the support that you're going to provide to it and through the development. Know your audience. That applies across the board, but also from the platforms that you're planning to use. Make sure that you understand that on an ongoing basis through evaluation, and then make sure by doing that you can then develop your apps that are designed for purpose and that can be understood clearly by your developers so that you can develop the best possible product. And finally, think about your users' current and future demands. Don't think about just what they're doing right now. Think about what your audience might be doing in 5 years' time. You know, our farmers are becoming increasingly sophisticated. They're using a lot more automation on farm, robotics. You know, they're doing business in different ways. They bank on their phones. They look at weather forecasts online. You know, look at your specific audience. Look at their behaviours and patterns. Try and predict their future patterns and use that in the development process when you come to develop the app that's suited towards your audience. And I'll leave it at that, John.
Great, thanks Tom. We have 22 questions, so let me just fire some at you. Monitoring and evaluation, how do you do that for your apps?
Okay, so we use a suite of tools. Some of your electronic tools can provide some assistance there. You've got specific web monitoring tools. You've got Google Analytics, which you use on websites, but can also be used for applications. The app sites such as iOS, Apple, and Google also provide some analytics that you can use to look at downloads. We also use forums, surveys, polls, focus groups, face-to-face engagement at events. I guess the beauty of email and social media is people are quite open in telling us what we should do. We have a contact us site at GRDC and a webmaster site, and we get a lot of feedback through those channels. So yeah, there's a mixture of quantitative and qualitative approaches to evaluating the success of the applications that we develop.
Do any of your apps aim for practice change, and do you evaluate that?
In terms of practice change, we made a conscious decision in the first instance with our Ute guides was really to look at developing identification tools, which ultimately would facilitate practice change. And you know, you take weeds for example. We wanted it to be an identification tool so that a farmer could go out in a paddock and try and compare the weed that they're seeing and comparing it on their screen, and basically look at how they would then manage that, whether that's through a certain I guess application technique or management technique on farm. So all of our products were designed very much in a way that they had some application on farm. I mean, versus say a more news-related app, which is telling you about research, we could have gone down that path, and I guess more of your news type apps like your ABC News and ground cover and I guess online features are sort of more focused towards developing that content from a awareness point of view. But yeah, our Ute guides were very much driven towards practical application on farm, and so we look at that through a number of ways. We can see what weeds are more popular. We can then there's tools where they can share photos with their agronomist, and often we'll ask them whether we can get a copy so we can see a photo of what they're sending, which gives us an idea of the types of weeds they're looking at, which also helps us focus some of our products. But yeah, all the apps in general are designed to enable practice change. In the first instance, it's predominantly through identification, and then
okay, thank you.
It's the user choice from there.
Tom, what's the life expectancy of an app? Like, how often do you expect to be updating each of your apps?
It really comes down to your audience and their user needs, really. In our instance, our Ute guides have definitely been an ongoing popular tool within GRDC. You might not see all the evolution, obviously, when you go into it, but there is a lot of activity going on in the background. We actually have content-driven weed materials from the back end, so we can actually update new weeds as they emerge in the back end and as people open them they update. So we try and develop it so that the tools continue to evolve. We are looking at the moment to do a complete overhaul of the app now, just to see whether it still serves a purpose. But in terms of a lifespan, that weed app's probably been on the market for a couple of years now, and we probably review them almost quarterly internally, just to look at how they're performing and what needs to be done to them. But I stress to the user, it's really up to your user requirements and your audience, so and how often you update them as to the life expectancy of them.
Right. Tom, you've done really well. Thank you very much. There's a few questions left now, but they're fairly specific and talking about widgets and wrappers and things like that. So I encourage people to contact you afterwards. You're happy for them to contact you, aren't you?
Yeah, no, that's fine.
That's great. Well, Tom, thanks for your great presentation today. It was very generous of you to share your experiences and so openly with us. So thank you very much.
No problem.
Now, folks, as some of you would know, I've created a LinkedIn group, unsurprisingly, called Enabling Change and Innovation, as you can see on the screen here. So this is where we can continue the discussion after today's webinar. So just pop on over and join the discussion there, and that to answer some of your questions too. Today's webinar has been brought to us by some generous sponsors. So there's the Queensland Government, for whom I have the pleasure of working, APEN, the Australasia Pacific Extension Network, which is the professional organisation for extension in Australia, and also Citrix GoToWebinar, which is powering today's webinar. So just a few words about APEN. So if your work involves facilitating change in industries, communities, and the way we manage our natural resources, then you might like to find out a bit more about APEN. There's a number of ways you can do that. So obviously there's the APEN website, but you can also check out the LinkedIn group to find out more about topical issues and upcoming events. Folks, I love to receive your feedback, so we use SurveyMonkey for our follow-up survey, and the monkeys will be waiting to read your responses. Once you've completed your post-event survey, I've asked the monkeys to swing you over to the user voice site so that you can nominate and vote on future topics. So you can see here, this is where the one about today's topic about mobile app development came from. So you talk and we listen, so use that please. So folks, that's all for today. Thanks for coming along and interacting with us. I look forward to seeing your comments and ideas over at our LinkedIn group. So wishing you all the best until we meet again. Hooroo for now.